Okay, colleagues, before we begin our first class on the ancient Greeks, let's take a step back and let's ask ourselves, what is the subject that we are studying? What is this? Political philosophy. So in the most straightforward sense, political philosophy refers to the philosophy of political life. It deals with the foundational questions of politics, of human social arrangements, right? Sociality seems to be an indispensable part of human condition. So naturally, human beings are driven to ask the question as to what is the proper, what is the best possible social arrangement. This is one of the foundational questions of political philosophy in general. What is the best regime? What is the best way to arrange political life? In addition to that, separate but related question, and there are many questions, but let's start with these two, is the nature of obligation and the limits of obligation. The question of why should an individual obey? Why should an individual obey the laws or customs of his or her society, right? What is the nature of this obligation? When is this obligation necessary? And what are the limits of this obligation? So if you want to rephrase this in very simple terms, why should I obey the state? When should I obey the state? And what are the limits of this obedience? Maybe what are the conditions when disobedience is called for, right? You can see in this formulation a deep continuity between political philosophy and moral philosophy. Moral philosophy in general asks the question of what is the good, and political philosophy in this sense deals more with the question of what is the common good, or how does the good of the collectivity relate to the question of individual good, if you want. So in general, I don't want to spend too much time on these definitions because one could easily devote an hour or two to debating the various ways in which different philosophers in the past and today have defined the purpose and task of political philosophy. I think intuitively most students understand what the course in general is going to be about. This is not comprehensive in any way, but as a first pass, it'll do. So we are asking again, philosophy of political life. What is the nature of political life? And specifically, in practical terms, what are the consequences of our understanding of the nature of political life, specifically in terms of individual obedience or disobedience? Okay, more to be said, but let's move on to the second question, which deals with the way we're going to proceed in this course. Courses in political philosophy differ. They're basically, I would say, there are two broad approaches. One is thematic, take issues step by step, and the other one is, if you want, diachronic or historical, chronological approach. We're gonna focus on the second, chronological approach in this course. So it's a good question. Why? So why are we gonna go chronologically, and why are we gonna start basically with more or less the most ancient sources that we can find, at least within the Western tradition, right? So why do we start with the ancient Greeks? So in another way to rephrase this question is, why are we doing political philosophy and let's say not political science, right? You would imagine, presumably, let's say in physics, physicists don't really read Newton, right, today. So why do we read Plato and Aristotle? And there are a couple possible answers. So one possible answer is that actually physicists who think deeply about their discipline definitely do read Newton, or at least they should be familiar with the basic philosophical assumptions of his ideas. So it is not exactly true that other disciplines don't care about their history. They do care, and in mathematics, history of mathematics is also very important. Whenever basically you are talking about the foundations, whenever you are talking about foundational assumptions, right? And actually, if you look at philosophy of science, another course which I teach, you will find that, as a matter of fact, when we look at the hard and fast foundations of disciplines like physics, for example, we don't really see any kind of apodictic knockdown reasons as to why we must proceed in this way or not in some other way. So what I'm driving at is that even physicists don't really deal in truth. Even our best, most secure sciences, even pure mathematics, they are all, in an important sense, foundationless. In the sense that they are mostly rooted in social consensus. Now, of course, philosophers will disagree, and people are constantly trying to find solid foundations. And who knows? Never say never. Maybe physics or mathematics will be put on a secure foundation. However, there are important fundamental reasons to think that this may not really be possible. And certainly, in the 21st century, nobody has been able to convincingly show what those foundations are. Let me just parenthetically note there's a very famous theorem in the foundation of mathematics called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which very roughly, to oversimplify, says that any kind of logical system that can ground arithmetic will have to contain assumptions that cannot be proven within the system. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's good enough, right? That you always have to rely on assumptions which you yourself cannot prove. And it means that ultimately there's this important element of social consensus, right? So we're talking about assumptions which we cannot prove, therefore we must agree. And it's a social procedure. So you see, we're going to see this attempt to see philosophy and political philosophy as science, right? And here we're doing the reverse. We're trying to see science as a social enterprise, if you want, as a political enterprise, the political consensus foundation of science. So we have assumptions, and these assumptions are really rooted in social consensus, right? In many ways akin to political consensus or aesthetic consensus. Now, what this tells us is that, again, even in physics, we do not have the truth with a capital T. So what do we have instead? We have competing models which have more or less credibility. I mean, let's say in contemporary cosmology, well, we have lambda CDM model, whatever that means, right? But it's not the truth. Physicists have the highest credibility that this is probably the most likely model, but it has problems, and alternatives are definitely pursued. Now, in an important respect, we have to understand that social sciences, from the standpoint of contemporary philosophy of physics, are much more complex than natural sciences. Because, like, if you imagine some sort of a progression, right, we imagine that there's basic physics, and on top of this physics, we build chemistry, and on top of chemistry, maybe we build biology, and on top of biology, we build psychology. Well, actually, let's say psychology, and it's kind of complicated set of disciplines which are related to psychology. Let's say social psychology or political philosophy or politics in general. Maybe let's put economics as a separate sphere here. All of this with a question mark. So we have this progression, and as the levels increase, the complexity increases. Chemistry, on this naturalist view of the world, is more complex than physics. Biology is more complex than chemistry, and I feel that this is a pretty robust picture. So in this sense, it's no surprise that our progress in the social sciences and our consensus in the social sciences is much more precarious, much more controversial than our consensus in the physical sciences. And what this means is that we have paradigms in the physical sciences, but by and large, we operate within what Thomas Kuhn, if you want to read more about this, calls normal science or standard paradigm. And within this standard paradigm, we are doing what Thomas Kuhn calls normal science. We are engaged in problem solving, right? Because we have one dominant paradigm. But as we move up the chain, the dominant paradigm, the consensus gets, if you want, less and less. And once we get to social sciences and sciences of the human mind and human brain, philosophy of, science of consciousness or philosophy of consciousness, science begins to bleed into philosophy. And once we get to social and cognitive sciences, I would say that there's a porous boundary between philosophy on the one hand and science on the other hand. And very importantly for our course, what this means is that we do not have the truth with a capital T. What we have is multiple different perspectives. And these perspectives are in a dialogue with one another. So, presumably, hopefully, if we can dream, we hope that at the end, once we reach the end of history, and humans will finally learn the truth about the world. We will only have one physics, one chemistry, one biology, and one social science. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. At least in our department. If you take other courses in sociology or courses in international relations, you will see different paradigms. Let's say Marxist paradigm, positivist paradigm, post-structuralist or structuralist paradigm, liberal paradigm, realist paradigm, and these paradigms are in dialogue with one another, right? And which one is right? It seems, well, it's hard to say. We don't know which one is right. And I would say preliminarily, sort of not really the conclusion, but like the basic assumption is that maybe these paradigms are all not completely right, but also not completely wrong. That these paradigms or perspectives are complementary, and they all capture something, a certain aspect of reality, right? And in order for the student to understand reality as a whole, you need to compare different paradigms, and then of course there's a big question, problematic question, to what extent does each paradigm accurately describe the world, right? So there's definitely a lot of room for the student then to make up their own mind and to sort of, once you transition from a student to a scholar, you create your own worldview by engaging with these different paradigms. So finally, let's go back to the question with which we began. Why do we start with the Greeks? Because if we think about the whole discipline of social or political philosophy in terms of this dialogue between perspectives, the ancient Greeks, at least within the West, at least chronologically, they begin this dialogue. And all the later traditions that we're going to talk about, even in this course, are going to build on the basic assumptions laid down by the ancient Greeks. And as we go along, I will constantly be referring back to the Greeks. And also, when we talk about the Greeks, I'm going to constantly be referring forward to other philosophers who are going to engage with the Greek legacy. So that's the basic idea. Finally, there's a little bonus. And the bonus is basically that the Greeks are a culture which is distant from us. There's a certain distance between us and the Greeks. And this allows us to step back from the fray, so to speak. Step back from the passions of contemporary political events, right? And regard political life with a bit of a critical distance and with a cool head, if you want, right? The political problems of the ancient Greeks do not occupy us as much. And this, I think, allows for a clearer view. And we talk about clearer view. And in addition to this, we will see, of course, obviously, when you look at other cultures, you see their prejudice very clearly. And when we look at the various prejudices of the ancient Greeks, it will allow us to look at our prejudice more clearly. So this is an extra added bonus, and we'll have a chance to talk about specific examples of this. But hopefully, I've been able to convince you, at least preliminarily, that it's a good idea to start with the Greeks. So, colleagues, in the next segment, let's jump right into it. Okay, so now let's talk more specifically about the moral and political philosophy. Now, these two are deeply related and have been, historically speaking, deeply related fields of intellectual investigation, if you want. Now, this is a course in political philosophy, not exactly a course in moral philosophy, and there are differences. Now, let me say, the political philosophers have this infuriating worldview. We think that political philosophy is the most important discipline ever, that we ask the biggest and most important questions. Now, you could say, that morality, and specifically this question about what is the good for the individual, you could say that this is a more important question. However, I want to alert your attention to the following issue. You see, genealogically, or if you want, biographically, society is prior to the individual. We are born into societies. We are socialized into a set of norms and institutions which pre-exist our birth. So in many ways, yes, issues of morality are deeply important, and they will be deeply important for our course. But you cannot really talk about them outside of the political context, or so it seems, so it appears. Right? Now, more specifically, we could try to elaborate on this and talk about what does political philosophy do in general. And again, I talk about this question of the good, question of the individual good, and question of the political good, or if you want, common good. Although this is a problematic issue, some philosophers will actually call this into question, whether there is such a thing as common good at all. It's deeply subversive aspects of political philosophy, I have to warn you. In many ways, political philosophy is a dangerous enterprise and should be handled with caution, as if one handles a live grenade, I think, which in the right hands can do a lot of good, maybe, potentially, but also, if misused, could do a lot of harm. Now, let me elaborate and let me continue this train of thought. The primary issue, again, in defining what is the good, I feel is the question of autonomy or freedom. This, in many ways, seems to me to be the fundamental issue of political philosophy in general. That human beings are born free, whatever that word means. Born as individuals. We have consciousness, speech, maybe rationality. We have, it appears to us that we have an ability to make conscious decisions, right? And the question is, what kind of decisions should we make, right? If humans obey, let's say obey the norms, obey the customs, obey the laws, or even obey superiors, obey other human beings, it seems that this obedience is only ever legitimate if humans themselves choose to obey. This is a fundamental insight of philosophy. We will talk soon about the Sophists. In many ways, philosophy begins with the Sophists. They pose this question with great radicalness, right? Calling into question whether it is ever in our interest to really obey. So from the Sophists to maybe to Rousseau. So Sophists or Rousseau phrase this question in different ways, from different angles, but in a very similar kind of vein or style. I mean, they ask essentially the same question. And the question is, why should I obey? When is obedience legitimate? What can make obedience legitimate? Why should I obey? I feel that there's a very fruitful conceptual dichotomy that uniquely illuminates this question. The conceptual dichotomy has to do with the nature of human societies. What are human societies by nature? And the two concepts I have in mind are conflict and consensus. So I feel that this is a crucially important distinction which lies at the very root of political philosophy, again, with relation to this foundational question of why should people obey. Now, the conflictual view of societies emphasizes this idea that actually there's no such thing as justice, and there's no such thing as common good, in principle or maybe in this particular society. And in fact, people do obey only because they are forced to obey or maybe tricked into obedience, right? The consensus side is going to be the polar opposite of that. The consensus side begins with the thought that human beings are actually not really restricted by society, but first and foremost, we are enabled by our social environment. And even if society imposes certain limitations on us, eventually, or maybe in the long run, these limitations are good for us. They are in our interests. So the philosophers on the conflict side, we're going to talk about shortly, are going to be especially the sophists, people like Callicles and Thrasymachus. These are, I suppose, the two names most importantly associated with this idea of conflictual social ontology. So, Callicles and Thrasymachus. And on the consensus side, down the line, I suppose the philosopher who's most associated with this idea would be Aristotle. And Aristotle very famously says that man is by nature a political animal. We can only be properly free and properly human, properly happy, only in a well-ordered society. And Aristotle seems to suggest that it's better to be a member of any society than to be outside of society altogether. Now, to say some more about this, to flesh out this picture a bit more, Callicles and Thrasymachus both have particular concerns. So, Thrasymachus, in a move which broadly speaking roughly speaking, anticipates the philosophy of Marx, Thrasymachus is going to say that actually there's no such thing as justice. In any given society, justice is simply a mask for the interest of the stronger, for the interest of the stronger party. In any society, there's a ruling class, there's a ruling party. In aristocracies, it's the aristocratic party. In democracies, maybe it's the democratic party, etc. Right? And what the ruling class, what they find in their interest, they call it justice or goodness or virtue. Right? But it's important to realize that these words, justice or goodness or virtue, cannot really be taken for granted. Right? Callicles has a slightly different concern. And Callicles, in this sense, again, I'm oversimplifying, and please take this analogy with a grain of salt, but Callicles seems to be more in line with what later is going to be associated with the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. And so, whereas Thrasymachus seems to suggest a kind of a class analysis, attunes us, tries to bring into focus the questions of class domination and class oppression. Callicles focuses on the subordination of the individual to society, especially this idea that potentially strong and maybe heroic individuals, when they are born, they are weak and powerless as children. And so what happens is that society coerces us into a certain mold, does violence to us, symbolic violence through indoctrination, but also physical violence and threat of physical violence. So society, in this sense, subdues the interest of the individual. And let me, again, also signal this. From the very beginning, again, we have this issue, right? So conflict and consensus, this has to do with the fundamental alignment or misalignment between the interest of the individual and the interest of society. Again, a crucially important foundational question. I hope you can see how all of these questions are actually related. So society versus the individual, the interests of society versus the individual. Here we see conflictual relation, here we see harmonious relation. Let me suggest a preliminary way of looking at this issue. When I myself was a first-year student, I was always very uncomfortable when certain big questions were left unanswered. Now, again, questions in philosophy never have a simple and straightforward answer. Philosophy does not trade in knockdown arguments and easy solutions. However, so which is it? Is society actually conflictual or is it consensual? It's a big question. It's a difficult question. Let me suggest a preliminary way of looking at this question. I feel a good preliminary way is to see both of these approaches is, if you want, as ideal types or models that capture certain aspects of reality. Societies are different. Some are smaller, some are bigger. Some are potentially more harmonious, some are potentially less harmonious. So maybe we can look at these as two different sets of lenses through which you can look at social reality. And each lens illuminates certain aspects of reality. So this conflictual lens, this critical lens, illuminates the problems with social reality. Questions of injustice, domination, oppression, right? Whereas the consensual lens emphasizes ways in which human beings are enabled by society. And it seems that at least as a first pass, at least as a working hypothesis, most societies fall somewhere in between. Most societies illustrate a kind of a combination of both of these types. Yes, in each society, it seems no society is perfect, so each society has some measure of conflict. But at the same time, it seems even the worst societies do something for their citizens. I mean, if nothing else, human beings, when they are born, they die. Unless, at the very least, their family takes care of them. So I hope you can see now the challenge and the promise of political philosophy. Again, if human beings, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau says, are born free and can only be obliged with their own conscious consent, then we have an issue, right? To the extent that society is conflictual, it seems that we are not bound to obey. This is the challenge of political philosophy. This is the danger, the potentially insidious character of political philosophy, the critical character of political philosophy. But on the other hand, if we agree with Aristotle and we say that actually society first and foremost enables us, and the restrictions that society imposes are either for our own good, or let's say even if they are technically speaking evil, they are necessary evils, or at least lesser evils, by contrast to not be members of society, then the idea is that human beings could obey and yet obey freely. Because again, to the extent that society enables us, to the extent that society is essentially harmonious, we can freely choose to obey. Again, it's a fundamental issue, fundamental question. So the task of political philosophy to identify the positive enabling aspects of society, to identify the negative conflictual elements of society, and hopefully, to pave a way forward, pave a way towards social progress. So, let us begin. Where shall we begin? Let's begin at the beginning. At the beginning of philosophy, when and why do people begin to philosophize? Obviously, that is a very broad and a very difficult question to answer. In general, it seems safe to say that human beings always have thought about their lives, ever since humans were capable of conscious thought. However, philosophy as a discipline begins, I feel, with a very peculiar experience. So for the vast majority of people, as far as we can tell, there's something that you can call the normal course of events. And in the normal course of events, apparently, for the vast majority of people, the major decisions in life are really made on the basis of what you could call traditional values, some kind of unreflective habit of just following the normal course of society. When we are born, ever since we are born, society, broadly speaking, tells us what we are expected to do, right? There's a normal course of events. There's the thing to be done in any given situation, a set of expectations. If you want, something like a script. However, sometimes, rarely it seems, people can experience a certain break in the normal course of events. Characteristically, this happens in times of social crisis. So our first topic that we're going to begin with, and in fact, it seems that political philosophy in the West begins with this precise time period or event. Our first topic, we're going to talk about the ancient sophists, the sophists. It's a complicated term, a bit of an umbrella term which should be taken with a grain of salt. Many of the so-called sophists did not actually call themselves sophists, but we'll get there in due time. But the point is that human beings at some point in their lives could experience something like a break or a suspension of the normal operation of life. And sometimes this happens to a culture, not just to an individual person. Parenthetically, let me immediately note, when you talk about social condition of doing philosophy, very often, so what we're talking about, right? So as opposed to traditional, like uncritical, unreflective acceptance of tradition, people engage in critical reflection. By and large, this critical reflection seems to be a kind of a luxury. Most people in the street do not have the leisure, do not have the free time, and often do not have the education to really engage in this critical reflection seriously. However, if we were to pause, and now I'm kind of talking about two things at the same time. I want to try to get us into the mindset of the ancient sophists. So I'm talking about them. I'm trying to reconstruct what they might have thought, although most of their writings are lost, and we don't really have their diaries or anything like that. So we do have to engage in a bit of an imaginative reconstruction. So, and in the course of this imaginative reconstruction, I invite us, you and me, to think, to try to get ourselves into this mindset. So, when the normal course of events is suspended, we realize our existence as a problem for us. We think deeply I think right now, why am I standing here giving this lecture? And I try to give some answer. The answer lies in the past. The past, which is not really available in an unproblematic fashion, but which only really exists in my memory. So I have to think about this. I have to engage my memory. So I remember emerging from the unconsciousness of night sleep this morning, right? Or if I want to go back even further, in my memory, I always already find myself emerging from the unconsciousness of early babyhood. I find myself always already thrown into this world. I find myself without a manual. I find myself with particular beliefs, values, and desires, and these are important. These structure my life. But the problem is that my beliefs, values, and desires mostly hang in the air. My beliefs are grounded by other beliefs. My values are grounded by other values. My desires, again, something I find myself with. I don't really choose my desires. So people choose certain things, again, beliefs or, goals in life or things to shop for, but we choose on the basis of things that we do not choose, but which we already find ourselves with, always already find ourselves with. And if I think about it carefully, right, so among my beliefs, values, and desires, a very important fact of my life is, of course, the anticipation of death. Now, to be philosophical about this, we're not really sure if we're going to die. In some deep sense, I guess the fact of our death can never really be, or potentially could never really be, a fact for our consciousness if we truly die, if we truly cease to exist. But still, there is this anticipation of death. So strung between these two problematic points, the groundlessness and anxiety about the past, and death in the future. What meaning does my life have? It's a complicated question, a challenging question which makes people deeply uncomfortable. But I feel that to try to answer this challenge, to look this problem in the face, to face this challenge, is what it means to do philosophy, as opposed to just fleeing, running away from these problems, and just running away back into this unreflective, uncritical acceptance of tradition and just imagining, oh, but my culture has it all figured out, and just, stopping the impulse towards critical reflection. Now, parenthetically, let me note that, again, I feel that this is what must have been going through the minds of the sophists. We'll talk about them more. But immediately, this line of reasoning, just to give you a reference, is most forcefully associated with the very popular 20th century movement called existentialism, and more specifically, these words in my head are rooted in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. So let me just, to pay homage to Heidegger, let me write his name. We'll have an occasion, a little bit, to return back to his thought as we move along. But right now that we have set the stage, let us move to the sophists. Hopefully, we found ourselves in the proper philosophical mood. Let's look at the sophists in detail, and let's try to examine where their views came from and what they were. Okay, colleagues, let's start with the ancient Greeks. So, what is the foundational question of political philosophy for the ancient Greeks? In many ways, we could take even one step further back and ask, what is the foundational question of philosophy, or just rational thinking, or thinking about the world in general? Right? We tend to think that maybe rationality or capacity for speech or capacity for conscious thought is unique among human beings. Some question about that in terms of contemporary cognitive science, but still, human beings uniquely, maybe, potentially uniquely among the animals, don't only exist, but also think about their existence. So what is this first thought? Where does philosophy begin? Or even before that, where does thinking begin? Well, you could ask a foundational question, maybe the most foundational question as far as these go. What is the human place in the universe? What is our place in the universe? So Kant very famously talks about the three foundational questions. What should I do? What can I hope for? What can I know? And these three questions, Kant says, can be reduced to the fourth most fundamental question. What is a human being? Right? In this sense, what is the human place in the structure of the entire universe? And presumably, ever since human beings were capable of posing questions, presumably, as far as we can imagine, human beings have always asked those kinds of questions. And this inquiry possibly begins within the sphere of what we would today call myth or religion. So myth or religion, mythological or religious traditions. Now, more specifically, when you ask, what is the human place in the cosmos? Kind of an essential part, a foundational part of that question is this universe our home? Is there a place for a human being in the universe? Is this world, as the Greeks would put it, is it a cosmos which means an orderly place? We get the word cosmetic from here. Or is this world a chaos? Is this world essentially chaotic or cosmetic, right? Is this world, in the words of Immanuel Kant, the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter, or is it some kind of natural or divine, or natural and divine harmony at the same time, which is somehow made for human beings, or at least human beings have a place in it? Or are we thrown into this world doomed to be alienated and unhappy? More to be said about this, but let's start somewhere. So within the mythological or religious tradition, especially for the ancient Greeks, in the works of the poets, such as Homer or Hesiod, there is this understanding that there's a single divinely sanctioned order in the universe. It's both natural and moral, right? So there's, if you want, there's one committee of Olympian gods presided over by Zeus who order the natural events of the universe. And also these gods somehow preside over or oversee matters of morality and justice, right? So it is the will of the gods that the seasons change, and it is also the will of the gods that humans don't lie, don't steal, pay taxes, etc., right? And within the mythological or religious tradition, this is probably supposed to be a matter of revelation, divine revelation. So Homer, for example, is a prophet. So prophet or prophecy, right? Prophecy, we're talking about prophecy in this sense. A prophet is somebody who speaks for the gods, right? The Iliad begins, the first line of the Iliad is, sing goddess the wrath of Achilles. So Homer is invoking the muse. Homer invokes the muse, asks praise to the muse, so that the goddess takes over his mortal body and speak through his mouth. Notice that there is a certain kind of pessimism embedded within this mythological or religious tradition. The idea that human mind is limited. Human beings, without the help of the gods, cannot really know the deep fundamental foundational truths about the world. Homer needs a muse to inspire him in order to be able to say something true about the universe, right? And within this tradition, very much it's important that this world is a cosmos, and humans have a place in it. And in an important respect, it is our task, our duty in life to obey the social conventions, right? The norms of justice. In some sense, we could understand by this approach, there's a certain problem, there's a certain uncritical acceptance of tradition. Again, you see, the prophet just tells you what the gods think. The prophet doesn't give any reasons. So this is, if you want, uncritical or pre-critical stage. So essential, integral to this mythological or religious tradition, this idea of the limitation of human intellect, and therefore, as a consequence, in some sense, mythology or religion in its own terms, at least in this frame of reference, seems to suggest a necessity of uncritical acceptance, belief. You believe without justification, maybe because justification cannot be given, because human intellect is limited. So there's this important uncritical element, uncritical or maybe pre-critical element. The prophet is inspired, and the prophet seeks to inspire without necessarily giving any kind of justification. So next, chronologically, and I mean, Homer and Hesiod represent the oldest traditions probably which had existed as oral tradition, right? Before they were written down. So this is ancient tradition vis-a-vis the Greek life. Important parallels could be drawn to other religious traditions, especially to the Abrahamic tradition in Christianity or Judaism or Islam. We'll get there in due course. But let's proceed. So we begin with the myth, and then chronologically, we have the appearance of philosophy. So traditionally, the first philosopher is supposed to be Thales of Miletus. So Greek philosophy begins on the western coast of Asia Minor, today Turkey. Natural philosophy seeks to explain the world in rational terms. We don't really have the full writings of the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, Ionians, Milesians, Eleatics. We don't really have them in full, surviving up until this day. Only fragments survive. So we have to do a lot of reconstruction. But as far as we can tell, natural philosophy seeks to uncover, again, objective regularities. Regularities which are discoverable through experience, through reason. And if this is uncritical and in some sense, I want to say private, because it is the muse one-on-one that inspires a particular prophet, natural philosophy begins as a deeply public enterprise. So a philosopher like Thales proposes a hypothesis, and the philosopher needs to talk to other people and to try to convince them of the truth of his hypothesis, right? And so, very importantly, once we get to natural philosophy, we're talking about regularities, and these regularities are discoverable by reason. Let me just give one example. Thales is said to have predicted a solar eclipse of the sun. So, whereas the mythological or religious tradition would say that the sun is blotted out, maybe because gods or Zeus is angry because of some great transgression that has happened, and Zeus is in wrath. But Thales, again, trying to reconstruct ancient astronomy, right? Thales looks at a particular regularity in the celestial motions and is able to predict the eclipse, which would kind of suggest that the eclipse happens independently of the human world, and possibly even independently of the arbitrary will of the gods. Right? Instead of the arbitrary will of the gods, now we have a necessary regularity, a law of nature, if you want. And, but again, so we are talking about a regularity which is discoverable by reason and is, has it's a verifiable element. So it is discoverable and verifiable. And therefore, if this was uncritical here, because now we can verify, we can engage in critical reflection, not just take on faith, but actually ask for arguments. Now, before we proceed, let's ask this question. So is the world chaos or cosmos? Well, for Homer, within his prophecy, the world is a cosmos. The world is cosmetic. It is our home, and Zeus makes sure that justice is done one way or another, that evil people are punished, or maybe at least their children are punished, and good people prosper, or maybe at least their children prosper. So there is some cosmic justice. But does it have to be the case? Well, in principle, since ancient times, we know of other traditions, other religious, and that's the problem with religious thought. There are many different religions, there are many different prophets. And in principle, even some of the ancient Greek myths seem to suggest that gods do not necessarily care about us all that much. Or maybe even that gods are evil or cruel. That's a possibility which is already embedded in the mythological or religious tradition. But once we get to natural philosophy, this becomes even more apparent. Because if the eclipse is the expression of the divine wrath of Zeus, you can say, well, you can hope that Zeus's wrath is justified. If it's just a natural regularity, then maybe there is no deep reason for it. Maybe gods don't exist. Or maybe if gods exist, they do not care about us. It's a deeply disconcerting fact. And we can begin to see how within the natural philosophers, at least already implicitly, we get a disjunction, a potential for a disjunction between the laws of nature, physis in Greek, and the laws of society. So both are laws, and the word law is the same, But I hope you can see the difference, a huge gap between the idea of the law of nature and the law of society, the moral law. The law of nature represents the essential structure of the world, what the world is. The law of society tells us what we should do, right? And again, within the mythological tradition, these were tied together, but in the natural tradition, there's a possibility that the two are different. Now, but the natural philosophers, the physiologoi, do not really thematize this question. Now, social, moral, political philosophy proper begins with a group under this umbrella term. It's not really a school, so take this word with a grain of salt, with a group of which has come to be known over the ages as the Sophists. And the Sophists were the first social philosophers because they explicitly asked this question about the relationship between the laws of nature and laws of society. And specifically, they were open to the possibility that there's a radical disjunction between the two. That the laws of nature and the laws of society are somehow independent or maybe even opposed to one another, right? And so a way to make this maybe more concrete is to talk about the question of justice as defined by the social norms and individual advantage. So this is basically what society tells me I should do, right? Society calls this justice. But there's also my individual question of my individual happiness or well-being or prospering or advantage. Could these two come apart? And so before we talk about the philosophers and these philosophies in detail, let's just in 1 minute look at the broad overview. So you could say that if the laws of society are not rooted in nature, like they were in Homer, right? It could be that they are a mere matter of convention. There's nothing essential. There's nothing natural or changeless about human laws. They are merely conventional. Human laws are man-made. They are not divine or natural. And maybe they are good and actually in our interest. It's one possibility. But maybe they are bad and not in our interest. It's a disconcerting and dangerous possibility. A third possibility, a hopeful possibility, and this would be an attempt to bring back the social philosophy in line with the natural philosophy, is to sort of go back to the philosophy of nature and to try to find the laws of society within the laws of nature, right? So it would be an attempt to locate a natural grounding, a natural basis for social laws in the fundamental nature of reality. So these I would imagine there are more possibilities, but these are the three fundamental possibilities from which social philosophy, social, political, moral philosophy proper begins in ancient Greece. And these are the three approaches that we're going to discuss in detail in the coming segments. Okay, colleagues. Now, let's talk in more detail about particular individual sophists. Now, it breaks my heart that we don't have more time to devote to these wonderful thinkers. We could easily devote, I think, a couple of full lectures just to the ideas of the sophists. So, lamentably, I'm going to have to be necessarily superficial. But let's try again to step back and focus on the main issues. So, the sophists, as far as we can tell, for the first time attempted to bring a systematic analysis, systematic critical reflection upon the questions of individual morality and social justice. So, again, we talked in the previous segments about the mythological tradition, which formed the uncritical basis of the traditional worldview. We talked about the natural philosophers who tried to give a rational account of the cosmos. Now, specifically, the sophists are going to try to locate a separate sphere of humanity, of human law, as distinct from natural law. Again, this very important distinction between physis and nomos, between laws of nature and laws of particular societies. Now, within this distinction, even to ask this question, right? Within this distinction, there's a danger, there's an inherent danger. When you ask, what should I do? How should I behave? Should I obey the laws of my society? Are the laws of my society good? Within this very question, there is something dangerous and potentially unacceptable from a social standpoint. Maybe you could say it is religiously impious. It is impious towards the gods to ask this question. Maybe it is treacherous or treasonous vis-a-vis your community to ask this question. Very often, religious cults would demand unquestioned faith from their followers, and in a similar fashion, particular societies, within the ancient Greek context, particular polises, right, individual city-states, would demand unquestioned loyalty from their subjects, patriotism, right? And to demand reasons, to ask questions, to demand a rational justification could be seen as doubly dangerous, right? Impious towards the god and unpatriotic towards your city. But these are the stakes for which the sophists are playing. Now, I have to admit, right? Sophists get a lot of very bad reputation. And very often, with some amazement, I see professors of philosophy teach a course like this with a tacit presupposition that somehow the sophists are amoral, immoral, and wrong. And a purpose of a class like this is to disprove their ideas. Now, very explicitly, I want to take a step back from this attitude and ask us to be potentially more open-minded. We do not know. Let's not jump to conclusions. As a matter of fact, you will see as the course progresses that the ideas of, especially the ideas of modern political philosophy, are actually much closer to the ideas of the sophists than they are to the ideas of traditional Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, as maybe we will see. So this is a very good reason to pay extra attention to what these philosophers hated throughout the ages had to say. Hated for their unpalatable conclusions, but we have to ask what are the reasons for these conclusions, even if we find them tragic, maybe. So the basic question that the sophists are asking, many ways to phrase it, the simplest way to phrase it is, again, go back to this distinction between physis and nomos, between the laws of nature, the natural order of the universe, and the laws of a given society. Are they in line? Are they in conflict? Right? So, but we ask a question of the relationship, so we assume, or we are open to the possibility that there maybe is a disjunction. Another way to make this question maybe more specific is to ask, so we have social norms of justice, which are defined by society, maybe even imposed by society. And then we have a question of individual advantage. I wrote the word advantage because it seems neutral. You could write other words. You could write, what is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose of my individual existence? What does individual human happiness consist in? Right? So what is a good life for the individual? And what does society define to be the good? And could it be that these two come into conflict? That to be a good person, a good human, and to be a good patriot or a good citizen, maybe these two could come apart. Again, potentially dangerous thought. Now, our first thinker is going to be Protagoras. Now, very interestingly, most of Protagoras' work is lost. We only barely have scraps. Actually, our main source of information about Protagoras is Plato, specifically Plato's dialogues. So I want to alert your attention to this fact. It was Plato who decided that the ideas of Protagoras were important enough and interesting enough to be preserved. Now, whether Plato agreed with Protagoras' ideas is hard to say. The traditional view is that no, he didn't, and that he wrote explicitly against Protagoras. But I want us to be a bit more careful and resist the temptation of jumping to conclusions. So again, Protagoras is a wonderful philosopher. One could easily devote a whole lecture or maybe several to his works, but I'm going to have to be very brief. So in the dialogue, Protagoras tells a very interesting story, which is supposed to illustrate the position, the place of humanity in the cosmos, in the universe, in the large scheme of things. It's a very interesting, very enigmatic story. Protagoras says that when the gods created the world, and specifically when the gods created living things, animals, to each animal they gave a certain special talent or strength. Some animals are fast, some animals have sharp claws, some animals are strong, etc., etc. But as the gods were creating all of these animals, the gods have run out. No special skills were left for the humans. Is this universe our home? The story told by Protagoras seems to suggest that the gods, in an important sense, forgot about the human beings. And so the human beings are born without any particular skill, any particular inborn talent, so to speak. It's a very important idea. We'll see later on. Rousseau calls this human perfectibility, which can be translated as unfinishedness. Human beings are born radically unfinished. Human babies are weak and powerless. Human babies need families and actually societies to become fully human, fully properly human. We are dependent on society in this way. So humans did not get any special strength. So as an afterthought, so to speak, what happens in Protagoras' story is that Prometheus steals, so very interesting idea, steals. So there's an element of transgression, right? Prometheus steals from the gods the crafts. So humans are born with no particular talent, but humans can now acquire the various crafts, various professions, if you want, like being a shoemaker or a blacksmith, right? So the ability to learn, which also has this interesting social character, right? You learn to be a blacksmith by studying with other blacksmiths, with teachers of the art, so to speak. And then Protagoras says that basically, the crafts allowed human beings now to survive, but human life was horrible. It was horribly conflictual because human beings did not have justice among themselves. And so Protagoras, maybe in anticipation, some of you may be familiar with the idea, paints a picture which is very similar to what later on Thomas Hobbes is going to call the war of all against all. And so as a second afterthought, now Zeus gives human beings justice. And Protagoras says that on the one hand, justice is given to all in an equal measure. That again, you have experts in astronomy or expert blacksmiths or expert shoemakers, but nobody is a particular expert in justice. Justice is given equally to all. And Protagoras says in the same fashion how every Greek person knows how to speak Greek, and any Greek person is, so to speak, an expert in Greek language, right? In a similar fashion, every Greek is an expert of what the justice is, or at least not an expert, but a qualified practitioner of justice. And Protagoras even says it would be mad for any person to admit with a word of mouth that they are unjust. So in the interest of saving time, I'm going to have to engage a little bit in some of my own interpretation, but I do definitely encourage you to read the dialogue on your own and to try to search for deeper or maybe alternative meanings which may be hidden within it, right? So what Protagoras seems to be saying, seems to be emphasizing, is this, again, unfinished nature of the human beings. Human children are born powerless. They need society in order to survive, but also human children are born unfinished and they need society to, so to speak, fill in the blanks, to teach us, first of all, the crafts, which are not natural, but artificial, acquired by studying with other human beings, on the one hand, And on the other hand, we also need society to teach us the rules of justice, the laws of justice. And in fact, Protagoras emphasizes that this is not necessarily a consensual task. He likens it to a straightening of crooked wood, or straightening of warped wood, right? So children are born, and then they have to be taught justice, and also very explicitly, they have to be exposed to a regimen of punishments, beatings, spankings, and threat of punishment in order to make this crooked timber of human nature straight and conducive to just behavior. Many ways in which one could interpret this, but it seems what Protagoras is saying is that justice is unnatural. Justice is not natural to human beings. Justice is conventional. The nomoi, the laws of particular societies, are not derived from nature. They have to be instilled in individual human beings through culture, if you want. However, the flip side is also clear. Protagoras says that even though justice, in an important sense, is unnatural, and so, in many ways, society has to force the individuals into a particular mold. But Protagoras is saying that without the laws of justice, we plunge into a war of all against all. And this is clearly in nobody's interest. So justice in Protagoras, in his limited consensual view, so I would put Protagoras preliminarily here in the consensual side. So Protagoras says it is in our interest to actually obey the laws of society, not because they are natural, but because the alternative is just too horrible. However, at the same time, immediately one could see that if the only reason we obey the laws of justice is because it's the second best and injustice leads to some kind of worse outcome for everyone, it's clear that we are not talking about something dignified. We're not talking about capital J justice. We're talking about a mere compromise or a mere second best. And in fact, rooted in this, the danger which is rooted in this problem, in this presentation of justice, is the problem of free riding, the free rider problem, or later Hobbes will talk about the fool's problem. The idea being that what if somebody were to try to break the laws of justice, the norms of society, and get away with it, right? One transgression will not immediately plunge the whole world into chaos. So it seems that the second best is when everybody obeys the laws of justice. But the first best, maybe, is for everybody else to obey the laws of justice, but for you yourself to disobey these laws. It's a dangerous possibility implicit there in Protagoras. Can Protagoras really offer a deep, principled defense of justice? It's not so clear. It's not so clear. And this question will be made even sharper when we get to other thinkers which follow Protagoras in this dialogical progression. Now, another important topic I want to introduce from the very beginning is the interesting, complex, and somewhat problematic relationship between religion and philosophy. Now, different religions and different religious figures will have different attitudes towards philosophy, and different philosophers will have various attitudes towards religion. So there is no one size fits all. However, from the very beginning, there is at least a little bit of a tension or uneasiness between the two. So another important figure among the ancient sophists is the man named Critias. And he's known in the surviving fragments for the following problematic, but also potentially very important hypothesis, that it is not gods who make men. It is not gods who make men, but it is men who invent gods. So basically, this is a particular statement of atheism, but to be more and more precise, I mean, in some sense, Critias here, you could say, is anticipating the famous statement later by somebody like Ludwig Feuerbach, but Critias is more specific, right? The idea that the notion of religion and the notion of gods, and especially the notion of afterlife, rewards and punishments of afterlife, these statements are not literally true in any sense, or at least human beings have no way of knowing that. But the purpose of these statements, the essence of these statements, is not their truth, but the essence of their statements is their social effect. More specifically, that talking about religion and talking about the afterlife, the social discourse about religion and about the afterlife, is supposed to make men more obedient to the laws and customs and norms of society. So somebody may very well think that they could get away with committing crimes because human beings will not find out or will not catch them, but the religious discourse introduces a possibility that gods see everything and gods will punish the transgression in the afterlife, or maybe will visit the punishment upon the children of the perpetrator, right? So that justice in the end, not necessarily immediately, but in the end, justice will be done. Now, again, more to be said about this, but let me just leave you with a couple of notions. So you could say on the plus side, again, in terms of conflict and consensus, you could say this is an important positive function of religion. So religion, whether it's literally true or not, is still important politically because it reinforces the social bond. And we will talk in this course about many philosophers who themselves possibly don't believe in God, but still think that religion has this essential positive role, and religion, even though not literally true, is necessary for a well-functioning society. That's point number one. But on the flip side, if you think in terms of the conflictual worldview, if you imagine societies which are less than perfect, societies which are less than harmonious, societies that many of us today would consider violent, exploitative, deeply unjust, right? Societies that promote or endorse slavery or some kind of feudal arrangement in terms of serfdom, right? So religion then could be used to keep the subordinate populations in check, right? So there is this kind of double-edged sword, if you want, right? Religion might make men more apt to obedience, for better, if we believe in the positive side and the consensual side, or for worse, if we believe in the conflictual side. So, and this general dialogue, I would say very fruitful, very important dialogue between religion and philosophy, is something that we need to keep in mind throughout the rest of the course. Okay, colleagues, before we continue with the sophists, let me just say that it breaks my heart that we have to rush through all of these wonderful thinkers, but in the interest of saving time, I hope that you will take this as an invitation to go deeper into all of these wonderful topics at your own pace. So, going back to Protagoras, we saw, again, this contrast between physis, the laws of nature, and nomos, or nomoi, the laws of society. And specifically, this intimation in Protagoras that the customs, traditions, and laws of one society, the rules of justice, are merely conventional, artificial, if you want, in the bad sense of the word, right? But at the same time, even though justice is merely artificial, it's not rooted in any kind of natural necessity, but at the same time, Protagoras emphasizes that without justice, without some conventions of justice, human societies plunge into this chaos and war of all against all, which is in nobody's interest. So even though justice is conventional, it is in an important sense in our interest to still obey the laws of justice. It's a defense of justice, not justice with a capital J, but justice with a small j, as merely conventional. And it's a limited defense. And it is open to the potential criticism, to the potential free rider problem, or again, as Thomas Hobbes later will call it, the fool's problem. This idea that you can individually break the laws of justice, and if you can get away with it, that's the best possible scenario. If one person gets away with breaking the laws of justice, or a minority of people, without the society plunging into a war of all against all. You can also see that when Protagoras talks about this merely conventional character of justice, it's a very famous phrase associated with Protagoras, this idea that men is the measure of all things. Men is the measure of all things. And in this sense, it seems potentially not men individually, but individual human beings are products of their own social environment. So maybe we're not talking about individual relativism here in Protagoras, but social relativism, that different societies come up with different rules of justice. And what one society considers to be just and proper, another society may consider to be unjust and unnatural. But still, right? Societies disagree, but Protagoras implores us, so to speak, to obey the rules of our society in the interest of social harmony. So man is the measure of all things, right? Says Protagoras. Man is the measure. But in this statement, you can see a certain very interesting and limited defense of something like democracy in Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things. This leads to a certain kind of democratic outlook. Or there's an important democratic element in this. Because whatever people collectively decide in the course of public deliberation to be justice, that is what we call justice. There is no other fact of the matter over and above the public deliberation. And when I say it's a limited democratic element, I want to emphasize that, of course, if people decide, if people go along with aristocracy, then you're going to have aristocracy. If people go along with monarchy, then you're going to have monarchy. So it's not really a defense of democracy, but there's an important democratic element in this. Now, to bring out this point more clearly, it's going to be a very important idea, which we will be coming back to in future classes. This idea that the legitimacy of the government is derived from the consent of the governed. And the government may be democratic, aristocratic, oligarchic, or monarchical, but still, it is rooted in the consent of public at large. Like, at the end of the day, questions of justice can only bottom out in the public discourse. And this actually is an interesting parallel between Protagoras and what we will see later down the line between philosophers such as, for example, John Stuart Mill, or in the 20th century, Jürgen Habermas, who are seeking to locate the quest for justice precisely in the free and open discussion in the public sphere. So again, very often, sophists are seen as the bad guys, the enemies, but I want us to be more open-minded and to see certain important productive elements in the sophists that are going to be taken up by later tradition. This is Protagoras. Now, let us talk about the limitations in more detail of the Protagorean picture. And again, I have to remind you that most of these arguments were preserved by Plato. Plato was Plato sympathetic to the sophistical cause? It's a complicated question, but certainly he decided that these arguments were worth preserving, which is, I think, a preliminary argument for taking the sophistic position seriously, but also a cautionary tale, because Plato is not necessarily an entirely faithful reteller of these positions. So we have to be a bit careful. And sometimes, certainly in the course of this discussion, I am engaging in a little bit of, my own personal interpretation, sometimes in certain positions against the grain of Plato's retelling. So should be careful about that. Again, this is a very important point. I should mention this actually every class. Everything is open to interpretation. And colleagues, I do invite you to read these texts for yourself and to try to come up with your own interpretation. I'm just trying to draw a preliminary map, preliminary sketch. Okay. So what is the biggest problem with Protagorean position? The biggest problem, again, is if justice is merely conventional, then, this is maybe a defense of justice, but it is only a limited defense of justice. And very importantly, we have these two names, again, both preserved by Plato, Thrasymachus and Callicles, two other characters that are broadly speaking called sophists, although I don't think Callicles himself thought of himself as a sophist, but, endless debates. So what do we see in these two figures? So each deserves their own lecture, but I'm going to summarize them both in one sentence. Apologies for that. Thrasymachus advances a completely contrary position. Thrasymachus has this hypothesis, you may want to say, that, Thrasymachus looking around him, looking at the Greek polis, he does not see this consensual picture that Protagoras is painting. What Thrasymachus is seeing, he sees conflict, force, violence, latent civil war, maybe, if you want. Thrasymachus basically says that justice is not a real thing. Justice is a lie that the strong tell to the weak to keep them pacified. When I say strong, I mean politically strong. So more specifically, Thrasymachus is saying that in every society, there is a ruling party, a ruling class. And this ruling party or ruling class makes certain rules for the sake of their own advantage. And this ruling party keeps the rest of the population subordinated through this, what you may legitimately call, I think, ideology of justice. And this is a position which is very much reminiscent, I think, of what later is going to be developed by Karl Marx. This notion of might makes right, that in any society, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the rulers made by the rulers in their own interest. And the implication that Thrasymachus draws is that, yes, of course, as long as the multitude is forced to obey, they do obey, as a matter of fact. But if, as an individual, you can break the laws of justice, you should. And the intimation is that the best possible position is to become the ruler oneself, ideally to become a tyrant. Complicated word. In Greek it means something else, but basically, a despot who rules by their own decree. And if you can get away with it, that's the best position in life. So also important echoes here in account of Thrasymachus, anticipation of important ideas in Niccolò Machiavelli and in Thomas Hobbes. We'll talk about later. Now, so Thrasymachus, I want to say, with this analogy to Marx, emphasizes this conflictual class aspect, that society represents a civil war, if you want, latent civil war between classes. Now, Callicles expresses a very similar worry, but in a slightly different respect. So I think that whereas Thrasymachus talks about classes, Callicles talks about individuals. And in this sense, I think that legitimately we could say that Callicles anticipates a later argument made by Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll get to Nietzsche and Marx in their own, in due course. So, take this with a grain of salt. I'm not saying that Thrasymachus is Marx or that Callicles is Nietzsche, but there's an important verbal echo. So, whereas here we're talking about classes, the conflict between classes, in Nietzsche we see this idea of individuality. That basically, again, think back to Protagoras. Human beings are born weak and powerless. And so what happens is that society takes advantage of us while we are young. Society coerces and breaks us. Society takes the potentially free and strong individual and subdues them, makes it its slave, right? So I hope you can see a similarity between the two. Again, the difference is that Thrasymachus emphasizes the class aspect, how one class dominates, oppresses another class, and Callicles seems to emphasize how society as a whole oppresses each and every individual, and of course, especially Callicles seems to worry about the potentially strong, free souls, genius individuals, something like that. But again, the implications are broadly speaking very similar. So, yes, in Protagoras and Thrasymachus and Callicles, we're talking about how justice is merely conventional, right? Protagoras hopes that there's a possibility of compromise, and Thrasymachus and Callicles throw this into doubt, and Callicles and Thrasymachus emphasize this conflictual element, how actually justice is just, is merely the interest of the stronger, masks the interest of the dominant party. So, who is right? Is it Protagoras with his consensual view, or is it Thrasymachus and Callicles with their conflictual view? Well, I think you can see a certain instability, how one position naturally feeds into another. I may illustrate by referring to the fourth thinker on our board, who is Thucydides. Now, Thucydides is the wonderful chronicler of the terrible and ominous conflict that wrecked the ancient Greek world for close to 30 years. I'm talking about the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. And now Thucydides does not explicitly mention Protagoras or Thrasymachus by name, but we can sort of imaginatively feed him into the same picture. So if we start by Protagoras, by talking about this limited defense of justice, and then with Thrasymachus and Callicles we attack this limited defense, Thucydides seems to come in on the third stage and say, please, colleagues, let's think about the consequences. What happens if we begin to think like Callicles and like Thrasymachus? So Thucydides, as he is giving the history of the Peloponnesian War, he actually, on many occasions, he gives examples of political rhetoric that seems to go beyond or neglect or discard the questions of justice. So very famous Melian dialogue is when Athens is laying siege to a neutral city of Melos, and the Athenians basically come to the Melians and they say, look, we are stronger, you are weaker, therefore you should submit or perish. You should submit or perish. And the Melians are trying to appeal to the gods and trying to maybe appeal to the sense of shame among the Athenians that they are attacking an innocent city. The situation is slightly more complex politically, but I'm oversimplifying a little bit. And the Athenians are basically reply, look, considerations of justice only take place among equals, among, so to speak, equal powers, right? So again, you see how justice and power gets linked in this context. But between superiors and inferiors, there's no question of justice. There's only a question of might makes right. Obey or perish, obey or die. And Athenian, in the telling of Thucydides, Athenians very brazenly say that they actually also believe in the gods, and they believe that gods are on their side. Gods are not on the side of the weak and powerless, but gods are on the side of powerful. And sort of with their sanction, the powerful carry out their conquests. You can see how, religion can be used in this sense to justify any position. So religion is, in some sense, in the telling of Thucydides, no help at all. But why do I draw Thucydides together with Protagoras? Because in his story of the 30 Years' War, he shows the effectiveness of this rhetoric of might makes right. Effectiveness, but this effectiveness is only limited because, yes, in every particular instance, you can see how the strong triumph over the weak. But if you take a step back and you take a long view, not just this particular conflict between Athens and Milos, but you look at the Peloponnesian War, which lasted close to 30 years as a whole, what is the result? What is the result for this neglecting of the laws of justice? The result is that Greece is destroyed. Well, not completely destroyed, but Greece is devastated and radically impoverished. And in fact, I think one can legitimately see the success of the Macedonian conquest by Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, right? One can see the success of Philip's conquest precisely rooted in this devastation brought by the 30 Years' War. So why is Thucydides here? Because basically with Protagoras he says, look, if you believe Thrasymachus and Callicles, and if you act the way that Thrasymachus and Callicles seem to advise you to act, the result is total devastation. And so Thucydides, in this sense, seems to try to hark back to Protagoras and to remind us that, yes, justice is merely conventional, but disregarding the laws of justice brings terrible social consequences. And you can see, I think you can see the force of the argument. We have something like an unstable scale, which seems to tip this way and that way between the conflictual side and the consensual side. Which is it? It's a difficult question. Preliminarily, again, I suggest that we maybe try to see society as some combination, and different societies are different, right? But this is a point for, this is not the last word, this is not the conclusion. This is the point that we should keep in mind, and this is the point that we shall be considering, the question, conflict or consensus, that we should be considering in every class down the line. Now, more specifically, anticipating our next topic, we can try to do better. Maybe it is possible to do better. Maybe it is possible to say that justice is not just this conventional compromise, second best compromise, but actually, maybe if you understand the nature of the world in a correct fashion, the nature of human beings in a correct fashion, and see the real nature of societies, maybe you can find a possibility of natural harmony. Not this second best compromise, but a real reconciliation, a real unity of interest, a real harmony, this word harmony, between the interests of the individual and of society, such that you get rid of the free rider problem by trying to find the arguments that would suggest that it is actually in the best interest of the individual to really wholeheartedly embrace and obey the laws of society, if you want to obey the laws of society freely. Again, so that the interests of the individual are completely harmonized with the interests of society. This, by and large, in an oversimplified fashion, is going to be the project, or at least I think is an interesting way, productive way of seeing the project of later Greek philosophy, especially of the thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whom we shall turn to next.